Swayam Prabha. Digital India. Educated India.
Hello everyone, and I again welcome back all of you to this course on Sociology of Resource Management. And today's lecture, as you can see, is on rethinking environmental justice in the cities. Now, before I begin with this particular lecture, I would like to just mention about something very interesting that many of you by now might have been made familiar to what environmental justice exactly is. So as we see in several places in the global south, that many of the traditional marginal indigenous communities, they are subjected to several kinds of challenges because of multiple issues that are associated with environmental crisis. So that can be issues of mining, issues of forest depletion, issues of resource crisis, different kinds of issues which impinge on the lives and livelihoods of the indigenous communities, the traditional communities who are largely dependent on nature. So for instance, many of you might have heard about the Narmada Bachao Andolan, the Chipko movement, all of which are very good examples, I would say, of environmental justice, where the communities themselves made their voices heard and the communities ensured that justice is being provided both to the environmental resources as well as to them in terms of restoring their livelihood requirements, in terms of restoring their own cultural heritage in association with nature. So I think that this is an approach, the approach of environmental justice stands in a bit of a contrast to how we technically understand environment, environmental science, or maybe environmental impact assessment, environmental quality, which I would say are largely which can be measured in a way by quantitative methods, quantitative techniques. But different kinds of issues that we are doing here, for instance, earlier we talked about environmental racism, environmental casteism, then thinking about sustainable development, issues of poverty and inequality that are related to the environmental thinking. And right now we are talking about environmental justice. So all these issues, I think, require very intense and very in-depth qualitative explorations, because more than the environment itself, more than the environment as a resource in itself, these issues that are associated with the discourse on environmental justice speak about the lives of the communities, the livelihoods of the communities in association with nature. Many of the communities, erstwhile communities, as we know, in our country, it has been a very intense tradition. It had been a historical heritage to find different communities, different people living in very close association with nature. So in the north, in the west, in the south, in the east, I think all over our country, we find that our cultural systems in several places are very, very integrally associated to nature. So any kind of assault to nature, any kind of assault to the physical nature, to the resources, also means an assault to the livelihoods, to the lives, to the cultural system, to the belief system of these communities. And I would also say that these kinds of assault leads to an erosion of environmental justice, and this is something we have seen multiple environmental movements, as I was giving you examples from the Narmada Bachao Andolan, from the Chipko movement. So there are several others contemporary movements as well, there are several others which actually speak very, very qualitatively, I would say, about these environmental justice issues, which are very, very integrally linked to the lives and everyday experiences of these communities. Now, this is the outline for today's lecture. As you can see, that we would be talking about environmental justice in the cities, because in this module we are primarily talking about the cities, about the urban, and we will first discuss about, we will elaborate a bit about what environmental justice is, and to substantiate or to provide an example, later we will talk about a very interesting case study that had been a very interesting paper that is authored by Professor Amita Baviskar, and this particular paper is empirically contextualized on Delhi's streets, and the findings or the empirical categories from this particular paper actually illustrates what environmental justice in the cities look like. And further, we will also talk about a few more cases where we find that the urban marginals have been largely evicted through the so-called environmental concerns. And finally, we will discuss about the urban parks and problematize the very notion of city beautification and how this particular vision of city beautification or making spectacular cities is a major compromise with environmental justice. Now, I think that we have already understood from the lectures earlier that a detailed discussion about the social issues associated, social and cultural issues associated with the environment is very important, and more so when we are talking about the urban environmental commons. So, I would like to quote here from a particular paper by Gilopter, where this paper particularly mentions that environmental justice redresses structures and situations arising from environmental discrimination, and particularly environmental racism that we had discussed earlier, that many of our own actions are borne by the communities who are considered to be people of color, who are considered to be caste marginals, who are compulsorily who have to stay near hazardous spaces and things like that. So, I think this is a very useful definition in this context that is being provided by the author, that environmental justice redresses structures and situations arising from environmental discrimination and particularly environmental racism. Environmental discrimination are actions and practices arising from both individual ideologies and social structures that preserve and reinforce domination of subordinate groups with respect to the environment, while such discrimination with respect to race is environmental racism. This is exactly something that we had discussed before. I am not going into the detail, but we can, just to sort of elaborate this particular idea about environmental justice, we will introduce another concept which is just seems to be a kind of a, which would link these two together, environmental justice and environmental injustice. So, environmental injustice, as contrary to environmental justice, is actually a three-dimensional nexus of economic injustice, social injustice, and an unjust incidence of environmental quality. So, I think that many of these incidences, if we speak historically a bit, we will be able to find that the roots of urban environmental injustice can be traced much further back to the 1960s. And although the outcomes of environmental injustice may be apparent, what is not so easily noticeable are the subtle nature of power structures and relations in the city. And there are, I would be primarily talking about three different kinds of urban environmental justice problems. This is particularly being identified by the author, by the paper that I was mentioning. So I will come to them one by one. So there are three different types of urban environmental justice problem that the author that I was mentioning about talks about here. So the first is health related environmental injustice, where we see that in cities, cancer, respiratory sickness and heart disease are common. And it's actually, the author writes that it's actually a surprise that people of color and low income groups have significantly greater rates of environmental disease than their white, wealthier urban counterparts, owing to the poor background levels of environmental quality. The causes of such disease prevalence are numerous, but they are very poorly understood. Contributing factors may include poor outdoor air quality, poor indoor air quality, the disproportionate presence of allergens like dust and fumes from nearby industrial operations. Lead poisoning is also common among the people of color. Now, the second is spatial environmental injustice. Here we see that the author mentions that inner city communities of color have lesser access to high quality environments. The clearest urban manifestation of this is the organization and design of the spaces in which people of color and low income groups live in. Many inner city ghettos are among the most inhumanly designed and constructed living situations ever. The most densely populated neighborhoods in every city are those inhabited by people of color and the impoverished. People of color have long been denied access to urban public amenities designed to relieve urban tension and provide outlets for physical activity, recreation and relaxation with the often awful arrangements of metropolitan environments. Parks and open spaces in the city have generally been built in white affluent communities. And the last is structural or economic environmental injustice. Cities, as the global economic engines, continue to have a voracious thirst for labor, causing a steady migration of people from rural to urban areas across national borders. And this phenomenon does not increase the quality of life in most economies, but rather work to maintain international labor devaluation. Because of the increasing demand of housing, educational and sanitary services, as a result of significant immigration influxes, urban abuses rise. The loss of unique cultures as individuals are torn from their ancestral homes and relocate to hostile urban areas is one very long-term effect. So, as I was telling you in the beginning that we would be discussing about a very interesting case study, a very interesting paper by Professor Amita Bhaviskar, who has written a paper some years back. This paper is entitled "The Cows, the Cars and the Cycle Rickshaws." So, as you can see that, as the name in itself suggests, that there are three categories that she has chosen here. One are the cows, the second are the cycle rickshaws, and then there are the cars. Now, it is very interesting to see how the author, Professor Bhaviskar, brings these three elements together to draw a picture of environmental thinking in the cities, and how this very environmental thinking in itself is related to visions of environmental justice, or I would rather say environmental injustice. Now, what the author tries to say in this paper is the fact that in many of the cities, like here in this specific case she talks about Delhi, we see that there is a growing prominence of the middle class, and these Indian middle class, because of their recent increase in purchasing power, because of their very transforming aspirations, they would want to live in a city which is a world-class city, which has world-class infrastructures, which looks good, which looks spectacular, which has maybe high-rise places of entertainment and all kinds of amenities available for instance, that can suit their lifestyles. And there is a very interesting projection about the urban environment in this particular vision of the middle class, middle class thinking about the city. So they would want to look their cities hygienic. They would want that their cities have a kind of spatial order. They would want that their cities should be devoid of any kind of menace. And here exactly, Professor Bhaviskar talks about two categories. One are the cows and the second are the cycle rickshaws. So in the city of Delhi, as she mentions, that there had been rampant cases and public interest litigations filed over multiple issues where cows have been seen straddling along the streets of Delhi. So the middle class in the city would essentially not want to live in a capital where the streets are infested with cows, where so many cows can be seen on the streets. Cows are seen to be loitering, they are seen to be causing traffic, they are seen to block the roads, they are seen to cause a lot of inconvenience to the people who are commuting. So in order to resist or in order to protest against the movement of the cows in a city like Delhi, one of the most convenient legal instruments that have been used by the citizens, by the middle class citizens, is that of the public interest litigation. And it is the same in the case of the cycle rickshaws. So another menace. Cycle rickshaws look ugly. They do not suit the image of a world-class city. They are thought to bring very downward trends to a city which is thinking in the lines of a world-class city. So even if the cycle rickshaws are environmentally sustainable, even if they are not causing any kind of vehicular pollution, the citizens would not want to see cycle rickshaws, even cycle rickshaws in the streets of Delhi. But on the other hand, the author mentions that this same group of citizens would not be having any problem with the growing number of personal vehicles, the growing number of cars in cities like Delhi, even if they are causing a lot of congestion, even if they are causing a lot of vehicular pollution. Absolutely no public interest litigation has been filed against the growing numbers of vehicles, personal automobiles and vehicles that are found in the city, mostly because of the fact, this is a very contradictory vision of environmentalism, that she points out that this particular engagement with hygiene and civic order, civic rights, spatial order does not actually take into account particular things that are considered to be most destructive. So for instance, she writes that through growing advertisements, it has become a part of the aspiration of the middle class that they should buy more, they should shop more. A car is something that a scooter rider should aspire for, and with the ease of car loans and all other amenities, it has actually become an essential part of the middle class lives to travel in personal vehicles. And this kind of thinking, I feel that this is a very holistic idea about our vision of the city, which is in a very strong way connected to the environmental concerns. And the author calls this a bourgeois environmentalism, where this particular environmental thinking that is associated with the middle class rules over any other kinds of environmental thinking. And because this class has an imagination of superiority that is attached to themselves and to their particular visions about the environment, they feel that urban cleansing, projects like urban cleansing, eviction of beggars, removal of cows and cycle rickshaws are the only ways in which the city can be cleansed and the environment of the city can look orderly. So I think that this is one of the most pragmatic and realistic examples of our very compromise or the ways in which we are relegating justice issues associated with the environment to a large extent. So let us look at some more examples to get a bit more clarity on this idea. So I will again talk about another case study by Amita Bhaviskar, and this is an account of the Commonwealth Games in Delhi. As all of you know, that Commonwealth Games had been hosted earlier in the city of Delhi, and here we find a similar situation unfolding. So the author writes how the project of making Delhi into a world-class city is radically restructuring the city's landscapes. So for instance, during the Commonwealth Games in the city, the state very speedily tried to accomplish large-scale social and spatial transformation of great economic and social value, which would have otherwise been very difficult to achieve. And this speed and efficacy were driven by the fact that the Commonwealth Games would bring a lot of national prestige and status to the country, and India would get its recognition in the globalized economy. Yet, spectacular events such as these are successful in conjuring consent from the citizens, even if it means wasting a lot of public money, even if it leads to the exclusion of the urban marginals. The idea that the game represents the coming of the age of India as a superpower and Delhi as a world-class city, and the symbolic value that the games would boost local jobs and incomes ultimately make the public welcome this kind of socio-spatial transformation. And there had been different kinds of infrastructural growth, infrastructural advancement that were planned for the city. So for instance, for the games to be a success, it meant different kinds of things. So for instance, the author says that new air-conditioned stadiums were made, new kind of games village complex were made to house athletes and officials. The Delhi airport was expanded, and then there were different other kinds of infrastructural improvements. And other than infrastructural changes, many things had been removed and changed for the greater interest of the city. Before the games, I will just give you some examples of these, what are these greater interests, and you would be surprised to know that, as the author mentions, that before the games, about 1 lakh beggars were caught and tried in the mobile courts. They were sentenced to special beggars' homes. Stray dogs were targeted. Other visual embarrassments like the slums were to be kept out of sight, including the rundown colonies that had to be hidden from the eyes of the visitors. Vegetable vendors were removed without prior notice. Thus, these cases of eviction are just one example of the ways in which the state exercised very power, and in the course of repackaging the city, they redefined the shifting categories of what they consider to be legal or illegal at any given time. So, we find in another very interesting paper by Gautam Bhan, where he writes that public interest litigations, as I was talking about, that are very frequently and very very easily filed by the elite residents in the Delhi High Courts, have started to play a very important role in shaping urban environmental transformations, because these legal instruments, the public interest litigations, have the power to reconfigure the nature of citizenship of slum dwellers by constructing them as dishonest, illegal citizens who do not have to pay for land, who do not have to pay for a flat. However, the state does not acknowledge its own failure to build low-cost housing for this very population. We see that Asher Gertner, yet another very prolific writer on urban issues, in his essay on green evictions, mentions how environmental pollution is constructed as a problem embodied by the slum dwellers in Delhi. The Delhi High Court in 2002 took a complex ecological problem such as the pollution of the Yamuna and simplified it to the visible presence of slum settlements on the Yamuna riverbed, as if pollution to the Yamuna is being only caused by the slum dwellers who are settled in and around the area. Thus, the slum dwellers dread any high-profile events as it prompts authorities to clean up the city, to cleanse them out of the city. Slum dwellers are well aware that they are the dirt that the government does not want the world to see. It must be remembered, however, that it is not the slums that pollute. Rather, slums are usually located in a dangerous, health-threatening environment where the poor have no choice but to live in constant fear of disaster. Again, we see another very popular image where the government is attempting to create green spaces or urban parks. So, for instance, municipal parks in Gujarat, but by displacing slum settlements that has inhabited that area. And this is not uncommon. In fact, there has been forcible removal and several waves of destruction carried out in the Sanjay Gandhi National Park in Bombay. Even New York's famous Central Park was made by displacing a predominantly of African American community. So even though parks have been very popularly seen as very successful cases of ecological restoration, they are seen as very positive environmental projects. According to another study by Zimmer, Cornea and Veron, they have been majorly and very popularly read as political. City beautification projects thus must be problematized. When particularly we look at parks, we see lush green lawns, trees home to birds and squirrels. At once glance, what we see can be characterized as nature. But when we think about the time this urban park was being made, certain other things come to the light. We see workers adding fertilizer, the children's playground being set up, and the slum being removed to make space for this environmental project, as we see in this particular study by Zimmer, Veron and Cornea in Gujarat. This is when what seemed natural does not seem very natural anymore. It seems socially produced, as if this urban park is a part of the socio-nature. But what do these spaces reflect? We ask to ourselves, are these political interests involved? Are these economic interests involved? Who are the social actors who were able to influence or bring about such a change? So just imagine how integrally questions of the social and political are linked to issues of the environment, particularly in the city. Urban parks are always considered to be positive environmental projects, thus we never question these developments, but we instead support them. Urban parks are home to many animals, they lower urban heat island effects, and they also clean the air in the city. But who are these greening attempts for? Who are these targeted to? If the slum in this case was removed, then for whom these urban improvements, these urban restorations are for? So the case that has been studied in this particular paper was the Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar Garden in Vijalpur, Gujarat. The making of the park was decided through an informal interaction between the Rotary Club members and the municipal politicians. There was also considerable pressure from the state government, but the space was already being used by a slum. The majority consisting of scheduled caste population, ultimately they were displaced and they were resettled near the urban periphery where there was a waste dump. Many families had nowhere to go. When asked about the displacement, it was said that the urban park was created for the greater interest of the city. So it is apparent that this is an extreme example of injustice where greening in the city is happening at the expense of the poor. The basis on which the slum dwellers were evicted was based on the fact that they were polluting the environment. For example, there was open defecation which the other urban residents found filthy. But this was because the slum dwellers were excluded from many basic urban services like, and still they are so, for instance, proper sanitation facilities. This concept that the slum dwellers were embodying filth or seen as the filth in the city could have come from the caste belief of purity and pollution, as we have discussed earlier. If we remember, these slum dwellers were predominantly a scheduled caste population. In fact, they were also restricted from accessing the Dudhiya Talav, which was the drinking water reservoir. The Rotary Club members often complained about how the slum residents were climbing and polluting the lake. Thus, this relocation was largely made by using the environmental discourses of pollution to ultimately make the city look beautiful. Thus, it is safe to say that urban parks too are sites of great environmental injustice and political struggle between powerful actors in the city, in the urban societies. In fact, naming the park as Dr. Babasaheb Ambedkar was done to make the slum dwellers accept this kind of land use, as the character of Ambedkar is very close to their heart. As these cases and examples help us understand how different actors shape the city, the fact that nature too can be socially and politically produced is a concept that we must understand in order to analyze environmental injustices in our society. So this particular paper I would be sharing with you with the other papers that I mentioned over here. So you can go through the details in this paper to have a much greater understanding about what exactly urban environmental injustice is. So these are the main points that were covered in today's class. Environmental justice redresses structures and situations arising from environmental discrimination. In Amita Bhaviskar's, both of Amita Bhaviskar's accounts, we see bourgeois environmentalism is concerned neither with ecology nor with justice. We discussed how environmental discourses are being used to evict the urban poor. We need to problematize the city greening, ecological restoration and beautification projects. These are the references that has been used for today's class. Thank you again, and we will meet in the next class again.